And speaking of the government, a popular question we get, especially in the chat now, is people asking, and this is for Lynn, is specifically, what are the risks that the government could come after Bitcoin? Now, not saying anyone's saying that's a probability, but also as Brandon Quittem here at Swan, who we all know and love, is he has a famous quote where he says, "The government is hungry and your assets look tasty." If things happen to the fiat currency, he's going to love that I brought that up. As things get maybe more desperate for the government or for fiat, whatever, do you potentially see them coming after Bitcoin? Are there attack vectors to be concerned about? So, Lynn, I'd love your perspective there.
So first of all, I point out that with so many countries in the world, obviously some countries are more at risk than others. I'll focus the rest of the question on the United States perspective. Um, you know, the most commonly cited one is back in the 1930s when they made gold illegal. But one important piece of context there was that one political party had about 70% of Congress. They had a supermajority. They could do it. They could even kind of pack the Supreme Court, and they even kind of threatened to at certain points. It was a very like society all kind of coalesced around one pole and was able to do almost anything. And so, whereas today in the United States, we have a very polarized political environment where it's hard to kind of do really major sweeping things, especially things that would be somewhat unpopular. In addition, we saw from the SEC, for example, I mean, they lost in court about kind of their ongoing blocking of the spot Bitcoin ETFs, and their reasoning was found to be arbitrary and capricious by appeals court. And so we still have decent rule of law in a fairly polarized environment, which means there's a lot of legal firepower willing to push back on things that are unconstitutional or otherwise go against kind of reasonable interpretations of the law. Another really good precedent was back in the 1990s when Phil Zimmerman, published new forms of open source cryptography for people to use. And it got, because it was open source, it got around the world. And the United States went after him criminally. They opened criminal investigations for exporting munitions without a license. They were trying to kind of not let this technology spread too much. And so what he did was he published the code in a book and says, well, it's words and numbers, it's speech. And so he kind of relied on the First Amendment to protect him, and the federal government had to end up backing down from that. Even Adam Back was involved in that kind of whole period of time. They would make T-shirts that say this T-shirt is illegal to export. It's illegal munitions because it has dangerous code written on it, kind of to show the absurdity of those laws applied in that context. And so I think that there are a lot of tools that would push back against some of the more extreme things that could happen. And I also think that some of the basically the SEC approval of the spot Bitcoin ETFs and the marketing by BlackRock and Fidelity and all that, in a lot of people's minds, somewhat de-risks the possibility of kind of major draconian action against Bitcoin. I do think it's still important to be vigilant. I mean, there's certainly going to be attacks around privacy, the private use of Bitcoin. There's certainly going to be attacks against, right now we're seeing, kind of them trying to get information on the Bitcoin energy usage of Bitcoin miners, which is kind of unprecedented relative to other sectors. And so there's potentially legal pushback against that. So there are areas that I think to be concerned about, but there are a lot of roadblocks, fortunately, in the way of some of the more draconian types of crackdowns, including some of these retirement structures. I mean, even one of the attack vectors is like kind of a unique tax penalty against Bitcoin, and having it in certain retirement accounts might or might not, but at least there's a chance that it would protect against those sorts of specific attack vectors.
I loved your whole answer there. And I really appreciate you bringing up the political climate around 6102 with Jason on the call, because I have a training video for all the private guys where I talk about that and talk about how FDR was probably the closest thing to a dictator we've ever seen, and the political climate couldn't be more different. So thanks for making me look good there. But and I want to echo some of what Lynn said, probably even take it a step. Well, I would agree that I think the battlefield has shifted to what you're saying: privacy, energy, surveillance, tax. That's where the real fight's going to take
Yeah.
place. It's between Bitcoin, the asset, and Bitcoin, the network. And I think the ETFs and all the development that has happened I mean, Bitcoin, the asset is here. It's in BlackRock's ETFs, it's in people's portfolio. I've kind of run a rough kind of calculation, more of an estimation really, but if you look at all the Bitcoin that American owns, all the hedge funds that have Bitcoin exposure, all the mining companies, MicroStrategy, you add up all of that exposure, you get a very large, very, very large number. There's probably $1 trillion of Bitcoin and Bitcoin related exposure in the US. The government just trying to take that to zero is going to be a extremely uphill battle. But like Lyn said, we can't be complacent. This is not a done deal. Bitcoin does not just magically win. It's not preordained in a way which is separate from human activity and all of us. But I think surveillance, privacy, tax, those are the real battlefields.